Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors is a short, light-hearted farce that revolves around the most gloriously improbable scenario. Before the play begins, a ship containing a respectable couple and their identical twin sons, as well as a further set of identical twin boys purchased from exceedingly poor parents to act as servants for their pampered pups, hit a rock. The ship was torn apart in the middle, leaving the mother, one twin son named Antipholus, and one twin servant called Dromio, sailing off in one direction. Meanwhile, the father, the other twin son, who is also called Antipholus, and the other twin servant, yes, also Dromio, sail off elsewhere. The trio, including the mother, set up new lives for themselves in Ephesus, while the others initially returned to Syracuse, two countries that rather unfortunately have a somewhat draconian agreement to put anyone to death who travels between them. However, at the age of 18, Antipholus of Syracuse elects to travel the world in a quest to find his long-lost twin brother, and his father soon follows suit. As the play starts, both men are in Ephesus, but without any idea that this is the land of their long-lost family members, and indeed each other. The comedy of the play lies in Antipholus of Syracuse being taken for Antipholus of Ephesus, and vice versa, both by the latter's wife, sister-in-law, and other members of the local community, and a series of farcical consequences ensue, resulting in petulant violence towards the respective Dromios, angry confrontations, conflicts between husband and wife, and even imprisonments. As is habitual with a comedy, most issues are resolved by the end, as the characters on stage finally catch up with the audience and realise that there are not one, but two Antipholuses and two Dromios, which results in the impossible now seeming possible again, as well as a happy ever after ending. But beneath the slapstick comedy lies a stark reminder of just how much relationships between men and women have evolved over the centuries, and since 1594, which is when this comedy was first performed. So let's explore the relationships between men and women in The Comedy of Errors. This is Schofield on Shakespeare. In Act 2, Scene 1, we introduce to our first female characters of the play, though of course in Shakespeare's time, these would have been played by boys. Antipholus of Ephesus' wife, Adriana, and her sister, Luciana. Adriana is upset that her husband hasn't returned to have his dinner on time, and reveals her annoyance to her calmer, more complacent, subservient sister. Luciana responds that a man is master of his liberty, to which Adriana's reply is the indignant, "Why should their liberty than ours be more?" During the time in which the play was set, women were viewed as subordinate to men. As Phyllis Ratkin's writes in Shakespearean Women, inequalities between men and women were taken for granted and were sanctioned by law and religion and reinforced by the duties and customs of daily life. Adriana's question is a frustrated challenge to the status quo, of men having more freedom to do what they want and be late for their dinner if they so choose, due to their legally recognised position as the superior and more powerful sex. Shakespeare's society was far, far more Christian than the modern world in which we inhabit, and as Luciana's later words imply, much of the philosophy for the strictly hierarchical relationships between men and women stem from interpretations of particular sections of the Bible. In Psalm 8, the writer declares,
190.
Thou makest him lower than the angels, to crown him with glory and worship. Thou makest him to have dominion of the works of thy hands, and thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. O sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts To have dominion is to have control over, and provided we interpret Son of Man as male rather than generically human, the psalm seems to be saying that God instructed men to boss around all other creatures, including women, for they are also the work of God's hands. And so Luciana evokes this psalm when she continues to argue that her sister should calm down and show more reverence to her husband. She points out the beasts, the fishes and the winged fowls are their male subjects and at their controls. Man more divine, the master of all of these, endued with intellectual sense and souls, are masters to their females and their lords. Then let your will attend on their accords. These words are enough to make any modern thinking woman weep. The argument is that across nature, male species exert control and mastery over female species, whether they are beasts, fishes or birds. Why should the human race be any different? Moreover, Luciana describes men as having the quality of intellectual sense, of being intelligent, perceptive, and the implication is that women possess these attributes in far smaller quantities, if at all. However, given the inequality and paucity of educational opportunities for all but the most aristocratic women in Elizabethan England, it is perhaps unsurprising that Luciana is led to come to this conclusion about the different intellects of the two sexes, and it is one that her feistier married sister does not directly dispute. Luciana maintains that it is natural for men to control women, whereas Adriana shows how the consequence of this dependence of women on men could be unhappiness and dissatisfaction. She cries out, "His company must do his minions grace, whilst I at home starve for a merry look," just as Demetrius refers contemptuously to Lavinia as a minion before raping her with his brother Chiron, ripping out her tongue and chopping off her hands in Titus Andronicus. So the same word is used mockingly here to refer to the women that her husband apparently enjoys hanging around with. Antipholus gives pleasure to such women, do his minions grace, whilst all he can give his wife are sour facial expressions and persistently bad humour. The verb starve indicates, indeed, that Adriana has to wait a long, long time before her husband behaves with anything approaching high spirits when he is with her. And when he does finally behave in this way, she is desperate for it. So Shakespeare is portraying a marriage of dissatisfaction, a relationship in which the man is apparently abusing his freedom and largely ignoring his wife. Adriana continues her diatribe by asking, "Do their gay vestments his affections bait? That's not my fault, he's master of my estate." This question shows her wondering whether her husband is drawn to the beautiful bright clothing worn by such women, outfits which have the potential to entice, draw in, trick, just as a poor fish can be deceived and ultimately killed by the bait of flower or wiggly worm. Adriana also feels there is an essential unfairness in her comparison. Her husband Antipholus controls her finances, and so she cannot purchase extravagant garments to make herself more alluring unless he himself agrees to fund them. At this stage of the play, there is insufficient evidence that Adriana can be relied upon to provide an accurate representation of Antipholus of Ephesus, and indeed Luciana disputes it, crying out passionately, "Self-harming jealousy! Fie, beat it hence!" Shakespeare is showing that marriage, particularly an Elizabethan marriage in which women were so dependent on men, could evoke bitter passions that can distort truth. According to Luciana, Adriana's imagination is erroneously conjuring up images of betrayal and disloyalty for which there would appear to be little proof. The dramatic short sentences and vigorous imperative beats highlights just how worked up the human mind can get when aroused into a feverish state of jealousy. Such passionate negative feelings have the potential to hurt yourself far more than anyone else. So Act 2, Scene 1 presents a predominantly negative view of relationships between men and women. Although Antipholus of Ephesus doesn't appear, we meet his clearly unhappy and deeply frustrated wife, who is able to do very little about her discontent. Her final line in the scene is the self-pitying rhyming couplet, "Since that my beauty cannot please his eye, I'll weep what's left away, and weeping die." This line melodramatically suggests that her principal motivation in life is to please her husband, to look attractive to him, and if she's unable to do so, her endless grief will result in her death. This idea of the reliance of women on men is developed further in Act 2, Scene 2 of the play. Antipholus of Syracuse is entered, who of course has no idea who Adriana is, and the audience enjoys watching his increasingly bemused reactions to being subjected to such a passionate, seemingly random rant. But although the humour lies in the mistaken identities, Adriana's feelings are real, and given the opportunity from her actual husband, she would say exactly the same things. Reflecting on the early days of their courtship, she reveals, "The time was once when thou on urgent wouldst vow that never words were music to thine ear, that never object pleasing in thine eye, that never touch well welcome to my hand, that never meat sweet savoured in thy taste, unless I spoke or looked or touched or carved to thee." The reasons why both Antipholuses might give her no attention are different. One has no idea who she is, whilst the other now probably finds her irritating, but her feelings of pain remain constant. For, initially, Antipholus was a devoted lover who revolved his entire world around her, saying unprompted that she could be the only source of pleasure to him, whether the pleasure was in speaking, looking, touching or eating. The structure of Adriana's words is poetic and ornate, using iambic pentameter and the repetitive line beginning, "that never." Such a structure gives a pleasing order to Adriana's reflections on the past, an order which no longer exists in the present, as signified in her husband failing to come to his luncheon on time, an apparently insignificant symptom beneath which lies a much deeper malaise. Nonetheless, Adriana clearly still loves Antipholus passionately and unimaginatively, as shown in her insistence upon the spiritual unity of a husband and wife. She begins with a fervent rhetorical question, "Oh, how comes it that thou art then estranged from thyself?" before explaining the logic of this apparent impossibility. "Thyself, I call it, being strange to me, that undividable, incorporate, and better than thy dear self's better parts." Adriana's words show both an impressive devotion to her husband and an irresolute belief in the sanctity of the institution of marriage. Her argument is that Antipholus, by being distant with her, is estranged from himself, as the two are fused inexorably in love and marriage and cannot be separated. Adriana extends this theory further when she attacks the uncomprehending and presumably utterly stunned Antipholus of Syracuse about his supposed infidelity. "I am possessed with an adulterate blot, for if we two be one and thou play false, I do digest the poison of thy flesh, being strumpeted by thy contagion." Once again, it doesn't matter that Adriana is addressing the wrong man, although it does provide great dramatic entertainment and amusement value. Her extreme argument declares that if he commits adultery, then she, a part of him through their fusion in marriage and occasional sex, also becomes an adulterer. A strumpet is a highly derogatory noun, meaning a female prostitute, and Shakespeare's glorious transformation of this into past participle verb shows how sexual betrayal can seep beyond lust into the contamination of those you might normally consider innocent. There is no doubting Adriana's passion for her husband, but a single-minded focus on her spiritual and literal unity with him is intense, and at times verges on the obsessive. Shakespeare shows us how relationships can evolve from the excitement and delight of initial discovery into much darker feelings of jealousy and half-psychotic insistences on interdependence rather than individuality. We meet Antipholus of Ephesus for the first time in Act 3, and his standoffish description of his wife confirms the negative impression we already have of their relationship. In discussion with Angelo, a goldsmith, he says that his wife is shrewish when I keep not hours. A shrew is an unpleasant woman who is easily annoyed and argues a lot. And Shakespeare wrote an entire play based around the subjugation and humiliation of such a woman through his portrayal of Caterina in The Taming of the Shrew. Adriana is nowhere near as shrewish as the tempestuous, violent Caterina. But for Antipholus to use this word to describe her indicates how he sees her as a nag, a shackle, a hassle to be placated and deceived to make his life easier. This impression is furthered at the end of the same scene. Antipholus has been unable to gain access to his own home due to Adriana mistakenly confusing his identical twin for him. He's understandably annoyed about this. Nonetheless, his reaction reveals a desire to purposely hurt his wife, just for the sake of it. Referring to a gold chain that he had ordered for her, he decides, "That chain will I bestow, be it for nothing but to spite my wife, upon mine hostess at the Porpentine." The Porpentine refers to some kind of inn or pub, and it seems remarkably petulant and cruel to propose giving such an expensive gift to a pub landlady rather than your own wife. Antipholus even acknowledges that he has little motivation for doing so beyond the desire to be vindictive. In other words, he doesn't really care for the hostess at the Porpentine, and so perhaps his wife has no genuine grounds to be apprehensive. Shakespeare shows the depressing reality of a marriage between a man and a woman. Passion can disintegrate and dissolve into petty, niggly, demeaning acts of spite and malice. However, Shakespeare also shows how fears about a judgmental society can curb potentially, and in this case literally, destructive behaviour within male-female relationships. Furious of being shut out from his own home, Antipholus of Ephesus calls for a crowbar to smash his door in. However, his friend Balthazar, although not he of the terrible singing voice in Much Ado About Nothing, warns, "If by strong hand you offer to break in, now in the stirring passage of the day, a vulgar comment will be made of it against your yet ungulled estimation. It is early afternoon, broad daylight, and obviously people will gossip and jump to all sorts of mostly spurious conclusions. If they see a man breaking down his own door, it would affect his unblemished reputation or the esteem in which he is currently held." But Shakespeare also reveals that deceit can be a key role within a marriage, that sometimes it can be kinder to pretend to lie, not to betray feelings and emotions that may upset the other. After hearing professions about his growing feelings, Luciana suggests this uncomfortable, Dear Deirdre-esque compromise to the man she thinks is her brother-in-law Antipholus of Ephesus, but is actually his unknown twin brother. She advises, "If you like elsewhere, do it by stealth. Muffle your false love with some show of blindness. Let not my sister read it in your eye. Be not thy tongue thy own shame's orator. Look sweet, speak fair, become disloyalty." Shakespeare seems to echo Luciana's words in the figure of Lady Macbeth some 17 years later, when the manipulative monstress directs her husband to "Bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." Both speakers use repeated imperatives to hide and to urge men to seem sweet, to seem like a flower, but underneath to hide hidden feelings of evil desire. Luciana's final imperative, suggesting Antipholus morphs into the abstract concept of disloyalty itself, is particularly shocking and implies an entire transformation of his character in order to help falsely convince Adriana that he remains fully committed and attracted to her. The reason Luciana gives for suggesting Antipholus takes such an extreme course is that women need to be flattered, need to be told they are loved, and it is better they are lied to about this rather than being told the truth about their loved one's ever-diminishing feelings. Her conclusion declares that the sweet breath of flattery conquers strife. Through Luciana's contentious words, Shakespeare is painting a world of awkward compromise, willing deceit, and everyday irritations between married men and women. Now, to a certain extent, Luciana's words are framed and based on an assumption that the audience know is false, that Antipholus of Ephesus finds her extremely attractive and wants to make love to her.
Mark, you require 59.
Nonetheless, such a detailed practical outlook on how men and women should act to each other is unlikely to be conjured up on the spur of the moment, following an unexpected twist in the behaviour of her brother-in-law. Indeed, earlier proclamations about men being lord of the wide world and wild watery seas suggest a wholly submissive attitude towards men, in which few controls are going to be set on their behaviour. It is clear that Shakespeare is keen to de-romanticise notions of eternal love between men and women, and stress that sometimes adopting grubbier pathways, such as the one advocated by Luciana, can be prudent.
Schofield, on Shakespeare, you require 145.
Shakespeare may show that women in the form of Adriana may struggle to captivate and entirely absorb their husbands over the long term. However, following an initial meeting and in the short term, women can bewitch men. Just as in Act 2, Scene 2, Adriana bewails the fact that in the early days of their relationship, Antipholus of Ephesus couldn't enjoy tucking into his roast meat unless she had personally carved it, in Act 3, Scene 2, Antipholus of Syracuse's language shows how he has been mesmerised by Luciana. He asks her, "Are you a god?" and addresses her as sweet mermaid, then later siren.
Mark, you require 24.
All three references suggest that Luciana's physical charms have utterly bewitched Antipholus of Syracuse, resulting in a loss of his own power and control. In Greek mythology, sirens were beautiful, dangerous women. In Book 12 of Homer's Odyssey, for example, Odysseus is warned about the perils of the sirens, who enchant all who come near them. They sit in a green field and warble men to death with the sweetness of their song. There was a great heap of dead men's bones lying all around, with the flesh still rotting off them. Therefore, pass these sirens by and stop your men's ears with wax, that none of them may hear.
Schofield, on Shakespeare you require 132.
Antipholus of Syracuse feels that he has entered a magical world in Ephesus, a place where his name is mystically known, a city in which he is apparently married, a world in which his faithful servant can apparently act strangely and erratically. And so his hyperbolic language to Luciana reflects both this sense of awe and wonder at what is happening to him in Ephesus overall, as well as the traditional initial beguilement, which never lasts, of the man by the female. Just as Romeo stands below Juliet's balcony to wax lyrical and exaggerate to high heaven about his loved one's beauty and declare Juliet is the sun, so Antipholus of Syracuse talks gushingly of gazing on your beams, fair sun, beam by. In both texts, the entranced men want to elevate the female object of their desire's beauty, want to suggest just how brightly their physical loveliness shines, making all else seem comparatively dull and drab, even the source of light itself, the sun.
Mark, you still require 24.
But initial reactions to women in the Comedy of Errors are not also inflated and relentlessly positive. In the same scene in which Antipholus of Syracuse is calling Luciana "my food, my fortune, and my sweet hope's aim," his servant rushes in to paint a horrific picture of a woman whom he is apparently married to. This woman, Nell, works in the kitchen and is apparently soaked in grease. Dromio of Syracuse works himself up into a tether as he cries out, "Marry, sir, she's the kitchen wench, and all grease, and I know not what use to put her to, but to make a lamp of her, and run from her by her own lights."
Schofield, on Shakespeare you still require 104.
This-
Do your best.
This is a superb comic contrast to what has preceded. Dromio is suggesting that this, incidentally rather plump lady is so filthy, so covered in cooking oil, grease and other kitchen muck, that she could easily be set alight and maintain this light for a period of time. When Antipholus makes the practical suggestion that perhaps a wash could make amends, Dromio's response is, "No, sir, 'tis ingrained. Noah's flood could not do it." In the book of Genesis in the Bible, God, fed up with the wickedness of mankind, flooded the entire earth, sparing just Noah, his family, and 2 of all living creatures. The rain fell for 40 days and nights, and had God's desired effect, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. Yet, according to Dromio, such an unprecedented flow of water could not clean Nell from her supersaturated, sorry state. In depicting dynamics and relationships between men and women, Shakespeare is making the important and obvious point. Men do not find every single creature from the female sex jaw-droppingly attractive and alluring.
Mark, you require 12.
There is no question that the stresses, strains and inexplicable behaviour caused by characters on stage, repeatedly confusing the two Antipholuses, accentuates the existing problems in Adriana and Antipholus of Ephesus' relationship. By Act 4, Scene 4, Antipholus of Ephesus is in prison. Even worse, his wife thinks he now may be mad and has brought the dreadful conjurer Dr. Pinch to visit him in order to establish him in his true sense again. None of this would have happened were it not for the arrival of his identical twin brother. Even so, Antipholus of Ephesus' language reveals a good deal about both his own tolerance and feelings towards his wife. He cries in rage, "You minion you! Are these your customers? Did this companion with the saffron face revel and feast it at my house today?"
Schofield, on Shakespeare, you require 54.
Once again, we see the abusive label minion used, with its implication of loose immorality and servility. Ironically, Adriana used this same word to refer to the type of women she believes her husband enjoys spending time with when not at home. The second U is contemptuous and accusatory, whilst the adjective saffron, meaning dark yellow, suggests that Dr. Pinch has a horrible, unhealthy, sickly complexion. It is clear that Antipholus is still incensed from earlier in the day when he was locked out of his own house, and may be wondering whether his wife used this period of time to indulge in some kind of romantic or sexual liaison with her companion. Nonetheless, the suggestion that his own wife may have been taken in paying customers as a prostitute is deeply insulting and completely unfounded. Shakespeare shows how quickly outwardly respectable relationships between men and women can unravel and disintegrate when put under pressure.
You require 6.
As Act 4, Scene 4 progresses, Antipholus of Ephesus gets more and more worked up. Listen to this appalling tirade. "Dissembling harlots, thou art false in all and art confederate with a damned pack to make a loathsome abject scorn of me, but with these nails I'll pluck out these false eyes." The accusations of prostitution are now far more explicit in Antipholus addressing Adriana as harlot. For comparison purposes, just 4 lines earlier, Adriana called him gentle husband. Whilst he is so worked up about the animalistic instincts appear to have overridden expected modes of human civilised behaviour, he's prepared to rip out his wife's eyes.
Scooby on Shakespeare, you require 7.
Fortunately, unlike in King Lear, there is no god or less figure to goad Antipholus on to commit this terrible act. But perhaps the middle of this quotation is the most revealing. We already know Antipholus has a terrible temper. Antipholus is a proud, upright man, and as such cannot abide the idea of being laughed at, being mocked, hence the use of the intensifying adjectives loathsome and abject. To be scorned is initially hateful. To Antipholus is all-encompassingly humiliating. Shakespeare shows how male pride can erupt when threatened, leaving an indiscriminate trail of destruction in its wake, and figuratively battered and bruised females.
Mark, you require 6.
The truth about the existence of twin brothers is finally revealed to the characters in Act 5, Scene 1. However, notably, Shakespeare elects to focus primarily on the happiness of the reunited family units, rather than celebrate problems resolved between a previously warring husband and wife. The abbess, both Antipholus' long-lost mother, takes control of the proceedings and declares that the Duke, my husband, and my children both, and you, the calendars of their nativity, go to a gossip's feast and joy with me. Whilst it is natural after so many decades that our focus is on the reunion of her own family, it is interesting that she chooses to refer to the socially inferior Dromio twins, who share the same birthday in the calendar as her own sons, over any respectable-looking women who are standing nearby, clearly now important parts of one of her sons' life.
Schofield on Shakespeare, you require 7.
Shakespeare then proceeds to give the final lines to the Dromio twins, and the play ends with a rhyming couplet: "We came into the world like brother and brother, and now let's go hand in hand, not one before another." Such a final line is a clear celebration of their brotherly bonds, and a natural one given that both Dromios and Antipholuses will now have the pleasure of rediscovering a relationship with someone so similar to them, whom they have been apart from for the majority of their lives. Nonetheless, the abbess's failure to mention any potential wives, and Adriana's comparative silence as all is revealed, does leave the audience wondering a little about the strength of her own future relationship with Antipholus of Ephesus. Even the previously utterly enamoured Antipholus of Syracuse seems to have lost some of his zeal for Luciana in the discovery of his long-lost twins. He tells her rather lackadaisically, "What I told you then, I hope I shall have leisure to make good." Note the verb hope. There are no promises there. And anyway, are we ever told that Luciana is inclined to reciprocate his feelings?
Mark, the Bipster, still requires 6.
In the Comedy of Errors, Shakespeare presents an imperfect relationship which comes under considerable strain following a series of utterly implausible events. Within this relationship, it is clear who wields the power, the man, and who possesses the most love, the woman. Left alone to organise the household, the woman's imagination runs riot in what she believes her husband is doing elsewhere. Jealousy grabs hold of her imagination, leaving her more prosaic sister, and yet conveniently currently unmarried, to rebuke her and evoke biblical-esque reverence for the man. At the end of the play, all events have been explained, but question marks remain about the pair's relationship, and to what extent a relationship can be relied upon to provide fulfilment in your life.
Well, you were both crap.
John, don't be on there to pull me after you.
Good game anyway, but you were both rubbish.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the relationships between men and women in the Comedy of Errors. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the game.